Hi, boys and girls. We are on chapter 42 from the Ickabog, titled Behind the Curtain. What do you think is behind the curtain? Which curtain are they talking about? The kitchens were dark and empty when Mrs. Beamish let herself in from the courtyard. Moving on tiptoe, she peeked around corners as she went because she knew how Cankerby the footman liked to lurk in the shadows. Slowly and carefully, Mrs. Beamish made her way toward the king's private apartments, holding the little wooden foot so tightly in her hand that its sharp claws dug into her palm. At last she reached the scarlet-carpeted corridor leading to Fred's rooms. Now she could hear laughter coming from behind the doors. Mrs. Beamish rightly guessed that Fred hadn't been told about the Ickabog attack on the outskirts of Shoeville because she was sure he wouldn't be laughing if he had. However, somebody was clearly with the king, and she wanted to see Fred alone. As she stood there wondering what was the best to do, the door opened. With a gasp, Mrs. Beamish dived behind a long velvet curtain and tried to stop it swaying. Spittleworth and Flapoon were laughing and joking with the king as they bade him good night. "Excellent joke, your majesty. Why, I think I have split my pantaloons," guffawed Flapoon. "We shall have to rechristen you King Fred the Funny, sire." "Ha, ha, ha," chuckled Spittleworth. Mrs. Beamish held her breath and tried to suck in her tummy. She heard the sound of Fred's door closing. The two lords stopped laughing at once. "Blithering idiot," said Flapoon in a low voice. "I've met cleverer blobs of Kurtzburg cheese," muttered Spittleworth. "Can't you take a turn entertaining him tomorrow?" grumbled Flapoon. "I'll be busy with the tax collectors until 3, said Spittleworth, "but if—" Both lords stopped talking. Their footsteps also ceased. Mrs. Beamish was still holding her breath, her eyes closed, praying that they hadn't noticed the bulge in the curtain. "Well, good night, Spittleworth," said Flapoon's voice. "Yes, sleep well, Flapoon," said Spittleworth. Very softly, her heart beating very fast, Mrs. Beamish let out her breath. It was all right. The two lords were going to bed, and yet she couldn't hear footsteps. Then, so suddenly she had no time to draw breath into her lungs, the curtain was ripped back. Before she could cry out, Flapoon's large hand had closed over her mouth, and Spittleworth had seized her wrists. The two lords dragged Mrs. Beamish out of her hiding place and down the nearest set of stairs, and while she struggled and tried to shout, she couldn't make a sound faster than Flapoon's thick fingers, nor could she wiggle free. At last they pulled her into that same blue parlor where she'd once kissed her dead husband's hands. "Do not scream," Spittleworth warned her, pulling out a short dagger he'd taken to wearing even inside the palace, "or the king will need a new pastry chef." He gestured to Flapoon to take his hand away from Mrs. Beamish's mouth. The first thing she did was take a gasp of breath because she felt like fainting. "You made an outsized lump in that curtain, cook," sneered Spittleworth. "Exactly what were you doing lurking there so close to the king after the kitchens have closed?" Mrs. Beamish might have made up some silly lie, of course. She could have pretended she wanted to ask King Fred what kinds of cakes he'd like to have her make tomorrow, but she knew the two lords wouldn't believe her. So instead, she held out the hand clutching the Ickabog foot and opened her fingers. "I know," she said quietly, "what you're up to." The two lords moved closer and peered down at her palm, and the perfect, tiny replica of the huge feet and the dark footers were using. Spittleworth and Flapoon looked at each other and then at Mrs. Beamish, and all the pastry chef could think when she saw their expressions was, "Run, Bert, run!" And that is the end of 42. Super short chapter. Poor Mrs. Beamish, I wonder what's going to happen to her. See you guys next time. I hope you're enjoying the story.